Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and today I'm very excited to introduce our guest, Dan Robson, to come on and talk about his career in sports writing and sports journalism. He works for The Athletic, but he's also written books on Pat Quinn, Doug Gilmore, Johnny Bauer. I'm sure I'm missing some, I know that. And also has a recent memoir about his dad titled Measuring Up, a memoir of fathers and sons. Everyone should get that book as well if you've lost someone recently. And anyways, thanks so much for coming on. And how's it going, Dan?
Thanks for having me, Alex. Really appreciate it. It's going well. In the midst of the sort of busy fall, getting into the fall season of writing for the Athletic. So it's sort of coming out of the sort of summer lull into some fun stories that are coming up and some interesting stories coming up. So it's a good time.
That's great. I'm definitely going to ask you a bit about those stories a bit later in the show. But I just how this podcast kind of works is I normally ask the writer or the journalist to kind of talk about their career, but first, kind of how they became interested in sports. And I just wanted to ask, where does your love of sports come from?
Well, I played sports growing up at pretty consistently like my entire life, from being playing ball hockey and basketball in my court, and being some of the kid that was just watching Hockey Night in Canada and those kinds of things. So I had a natural just affinity and for the love of the game, for playing sports. And then in hockey, I played sort of a high level minor hockey growing up, played junior hockey, and then when I went to Queen's University for my undergrad, I was on the varsity team there. So it was just sort of hockey was ended up being part of my just who I was in a really intimate way. And it was sort of a love-hate relationship as well.
Mhm.
The love I had as a child, and sort of all of the the sort of dreams that sort of surrounded all the fun. As I rose through the ranks of sort of more competitive hockey in my high school days and at university, I actually saw a lot more of the side of it that I didn't love, and sort of the
Mhm.
negative reaction had to be. So I kind of realized in that there's this inherent tension within sport, and whether
Mhm.
you're playing the game or whether you're battling yourself within that, I knew there was a lot of stories to tell there. So that became sort of just the foundation of how I came of age in a way. And then
Mhm.
when I went on to Carleton to study journalism, I found myself drawn to longer stories. Like I wasn't going to be a news person in the way that some of our props were, or some of my colleagues were. I found myself drawn to the feature writing classes, the documentary classes. I really sort of fell in love with stories that were a little more nuanced and deep, and the opportunities to try and tell those stories. And there wasn't any sports programming at all at Carleton at the time. There is now, but there wasn't at the time. So I actually had to work through a directed reading with one of my professors to actually do a study in sports journalism. So, a long story short, I got through that, and when I went under the world, I ended up working at the Toronto Star and Canadian Press and CBC and all kinds of places. And I think kind of naturally found my way to the sports department. I didn't seek it out really, but just because it was part of a world I understood so well, I was sort of a natural fit there, and I kind of felt comfort in that space, telling those stories. And so, from a brief internship at the Toronto Star, where I had a couple opportunities there, I landed at Sportsnet, where they started a magazine
Yeah.
miraculously in 2011, out of thin air almost. It seemed like it was like a Sports Illustrated style magazine, and that is really where, for several years, I got a chance to do what I do now in my career, which is tell long form sports stories. And it was kind of like landing a dream job at the time.
Mhm.
And I've been very fortunate to be able to carry that in different fashions forward throughout my career so far.
Uh, I had you kind of ruined all the questions I lined up. You kind of so eloquently explained kind of your journey. I guess just to go off that, was there a time in your life where you were unsure about what direction you were going in your career, and that you when was that kind of moment, or was there a time where you fell in love with, oh, I want to be a sports writer, or I want to be a sports journalist? When did that kind of start for you?
It's interesting because well, the very start was tough, just because getting out of university, it's I mean, it's the most stressful part in many ways of your career. There's more stress in my career to come, no doubt, and there has been stressful moments in my career, but that very beginning, when you're still fresh and you're insecure and you're not really certain what you are, what you can become, I found it obviously quite unsettling, and I'm sure a lot of people do. And I kind of landed an internship. I traveled to Rwanda with Carlton, and then I came back, and internships dry up, and then there's no extended contract, so you end up having to. So I actually worked as a supply teacher for a little bit during that time, because I completed a teaching degree before I came to Carleton, and so I actually for a while wasn't quite sure where I was going to end up. But I just stuck with that and kept applying and kept writing, do some freelance stuff, and within a year I ended up being where I think I wanted to be. And it was interesting. Your father was one of my professors,
Mhm.
Paul, and I remember actually one of the things he had said to us at some point. I don't know if I remember saying this, but he said, you're probably not going to be where you want to be right away, but I promise you all, within 5 to 10 years, you're going to be where you're supposed to be and where you want to be. And I found that quite comforting, and it was absolutely correct. I mean, I ended up just persisting, always trying, like sending out stories and getting more reps in, so to speak,
Mhm.
and then finally got the chance that I needed, and took that. So that was a unsettling time, just because of the nature of how precarious being a journalist is, and being a young journalist in particular. It was really just trying to sort of get that grounding, and then. And throughout my career, I think one of the things I had the biggest trouble with is like not being a traditional sports journalist. Like I'm not, um, I don't really have much interest in it. Not I totally respect it. I love
Mhm.
all my colleagues, and I have some incredible friends that are sports journalists, but they have a unique talent that I don't have, which is covering a team, getting into minutiae of stats, being there every day, a beat kind of guy. That's never been something I've really been interested in. And
Mhm.
frankly, sports I think are really just the sort of the canvas with which I sort of look at stories. I think of the stories that I write as being somewhat sort of universal and applicable. So I hope that someone who doesn't care about the Toronto Maple Leafs, so I'm writing a book about the Maple Leafs, or doesn't care about basketball or anything in a way, will care about the story I'm writing about, because it
Yeah.
connects to them in a level that was unexpected. Kind of the way that a great business story will do the same, a great profile. So I find that
Do,
I kind of pull myself back from the idea of being a sports journalist, and I think that's been I think it's been a benefit to me, because it's allowed me to kind of create my own niche. And frankly, because I actually just wouldn't be good at the other stuff.
yeah.
I'm not good on sports radio. I'm not good talking about who should be traded and what's happening, or following prospects. Some people I know, some of my very good friends, are exceptional at that. But the one thing I've learned, especially in my career, is that there's so many unique aspects to storytelling and different ways to tell stories, that you really just need to lean into one that you're most gifted in, and that you find the most joy in doing, and find a way to make that work.
Was there a time where you felt that you were penciled into going into that type of sports journalism, where it was about the minutia, it was about the games and scores, and did you find it almost difficult to be more of a writer who writes about sports?
I've been very lucky. I should say this. Like I have to, I can't look back at my career, and now, and especially now I'm a bit older in this career. I know how fortunate I was to have got that first opportunity with Sportsnet magazine, for example. I mean, that was 5 years of. I mean, I got to go to Haiti to write a story. I traveled throughout the United States, to New York. I went to Nunavut. It was all kinds of play opportunities to get away from the minutia of the game. And I've had, now and then I've stepped in to do like beat stories and helped out. And there's a time when the magazine was no longer being printed, and we're kind of a digital space. And so how was that going to look? But I always kind of managed to find my way. And I don't know if I'm always going to be able to do that.
Mhm.
But moving over to the Athletic in 2018 was, I think, the right move for me in many ways. And it allowed me to bring the experience that I had to a website that I think, or to a publication that really values deep, in-depth journalism. At the same time, it values incredibly excellent commentary, and like fast, quick reporting, getting things up. And so I was able to fill a bit of a void there, and we can work
Mhm.
in tandem. So so far I haven't felt the tug to sort of say, we're gonna have to do this now. You can't do that. And I probably wouldn't do it. I think basically I think of the world of sports reporting in many ways, and like sort of the day to day as sort of a young person's
Mhm.
game somewhat. I mean, I know lots of people who are experienced do it, but they've sort of been doing it for a long time. it would be a huge transition for me. And I think I have the skills to do it and would try to figure it out and would go for it. But I don't know that I'd find the same kind of joy in it. So
Mhm.
really,
No,
that would
no.
be something I have to
Yeah,
figure out.
no, of course. My intention wasn't to say you should be or anything
Oh no,
or
I know. Yeah, I
yeah.
was actually sort of working through that problem in my head. I was like, how
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
would I react to that?
I guess to transition into firstly you working at the Athletic and Sportsnet magazine and writing so many wonderful feature stories, what do you think makes a good feature story and how do you approach writing a feature story?
It's interesting. I teach a class at Ryerson now about feature writing. So we were just talking about this on Monday night and sort of breaking down the elements of what it is. And I actually think it's quite simple.
Mhm.
It's I think making sure you have character and you have tension is the central thing. You have some sort of conflict that a character is approaching and solving in some way. My former current mentor, someone I know really well, Garrett Joyce, who's been a when I was starting out as a writer, was worked with us and was a great person to sort of lean on and give a lot of advice. And it should always be every good story is somebody doing something for a reason. And I think that that's kind of a hard concept to apply because we think, okay, well, conflict, like it has to be some enormous thing. And I have written about a lot of big conflicts, and that's there. But I also think even in the smallest kind of not even the smallest story, even in a story that doesn't seem to have drama in it, there's some sort of conflict, and it's the way you frame that story. You first
Mhm.
sort of frame that problem. So I think that a long form story has to have a really strong ending, and has to have the whole story needs to lead towards that ending. It has to have the arc of a story. It has to have that rising action, that falling action. If it doesn't, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's really great people doing great stories that don't have that. But I think that's the way that we consume stories. That's the way that readers will keep following through to get to the end of your story. So I think that that's central. So you can either be talking about somebody who's battling through the death of a child, for example, trying to figure out what's next. As I wrote a story about that years ago about one of my just touched my heart the most is about a family that there's a minor league player who played for 22 teams in 21 seasons and sort of clung on to this hockey dream. And then his young daughter, who'd been on the road with him the whole time, ended up getting sick, and I ended up traveling with them to St. Jude's Hospital. And that story to me was this incredibly human
Mhm.
story. There was like clear tension in that story, just about trying to battle against something that was like something they weren't able to quote unquote defeat in that sense. But then another story, like I wrote a story about Bobby Webster, the GM of the Toronto Raptors,
Yeah.
and that's a story that if you were to look at it, I think you would say, okay, well, where's the conflict? Like, it's kind of a story about somebody following their dreams. But really, what it is a story about is somebody figuring out how to make it to the heights of being executive of the NBA at a very young age. And what obstacles did he have to face along the way, and how did he maneuver around them? There's tension in that as well, too, right? There's
Yeah.
decisions made. There's strategy employed, and there is an arc. There's the sort of that story begins with him in San Francisco, just sort of sitting there as unknown GM and sort of figuring out what he wants to become. And then it's, they go through the rise of becoming a NBA champion. So I think it's that, to sort of long-winded answer. I think always trying to figure out what's at stake in this story and leaning into solving how that problem gets addressed, how it gets solved, and really relying on character to do that. It's like something that like a writer like Michael Lewis, for example, in
Mhm.
Moneyball, Blindside, The Big Short. I mean, the reason those books are so interesting and successful is that there's interest, obviously, from people who care about the minutia. They care about sabermetrics or care about finding efficiencies in sport or in the market, for example. But what really connects is the characters and the tension and the stories
Mhm.
that the people he introduces us to how they solve problems, how they go through conflict. And so, a book about sabermetrics doesn't become a movie that stars Brad Pitt, really,
Mhm.
unless it has conflict and character. And so I think that's underscores the point of why those are the stories that connect with people the most.
And uh, so you mentioned just that you look for conflict and character. Is that when you look for or trying to write a feature story, is it do you follow what you're interested in and then look for that said conflict, or how do you kind of find a feature story?
It's a great question. Think about that. I think I found so many different stories in different ways. It's sort of hard to sort of say here's the exact route, but generally it starts with a bit of a question. I can think of a few where I've seen a story. Actually, this is several stories where I've seen a story come out in the news, and there's questions that remain unanswered, and so that question ends up being the starting point for how I would go out and do it. So just for an example, my first one of the features I wrote back in Sportsnet, my first book that I wrote with Clint Malarchuk called The Crazy Game,
Mhm.
started with a Deadspin article about the most gruesome injuries in sport. And Clint had severed his
Yeah.
artery in his neck during a game in the late 80s and 89 and nearly died on the ice. It was a horrible thing. But it had been sort of used as sort of like, look at this horrible, gruesome moment in sport, and then sort of a top 10 list. And in that article, there's been a brief mention that also this guy somehow survived a gunshot to the head. Look how lucky he is. Oh my goodness. And it was just like, they just kind of skirted through it. They called it a gun accident. And I was like, well, that's weird. Like, what happened there? So I reached out to Clint, and he invited me to fly to Calgary, where he was a goalie coach at the time with the Flames. And we sat down. I sat down with his wife first, Joni, who, because he was on the ice practicing, and we just started talking, and she told me the whole story of this, his, basically 20 years of demons, of dealing with OCD, of depression, of alcoholism, of just, everything that came from that moment. And so it was really just a central question of, well, what happened next? I did another story with Donald Bashir recently,
Mhm.
former NHL enforcer, who is quite, it was unfortunate a couple of years ago. There's a photo of him working at Tim Hortons went viral. I don't know if you remember that. It was sort of like he's handing out coffee, and it was sort of just like, in a couple of newspapers, like, look at this person who's made millions of dollars now working at a Tim Hortons. And there was just sort of this typical social media schadenfreude and all of that, just like, oh, look how far the successful have fallen, all the stuff I hate about
Yeah.
social media, frankly, just brings out the worst in people. And so
Mhm.
that right away, well, in a couple of weeks, I reached out to Donald and asked, if he'd be interested in talking, and he wasn't at the time. And it took a year for me to actually get him to trust me and just down and chat with me. And I wrote stories about what that journey was. And what I found was that actually in his story, that moment of working at Tim Hortons and of having him being employed and taking care of himself, that was actually the beginning of his rise. That was the beginning of
Wow.
something he was very proud of. It wasn't a low point for him. It was, the reality of the addiction he'd suffered through, the trauma he endured as a young boy that still carried on well after achieving, his quote unquote dreams, right? As trauma does. He found himself as an adult battling a ton of things, and this was actually the beginning of his turnaround. And so, for me, that's where I think the best stories come from. Is just asking questions that haven't been answered yet, and realizing there's always more to the story.
Mhm.
And being curious. And so I think that that's where you find the tension. The tension comes when you sit down and speak to somebody, and you can kind of get a sense of the story itself. Like, I realized with Donald Bashir that the tension wasn't working at Tim Hortons, right? And I think that's where most people would think the tension
Yeah.
was. But the tension there was really how the story opens, which is him trying to break into an apartment he'd just been evicted from after a night of binging. And it was like sort of the last straw, and then he gets arrested. And it's the last straw in a long spiral, which his friends and family have been so concerned about him. And then we go back and sort of figure out how he got there. But then we come out and realize this story isn't what we thought it was at all. And I think that to me is the best kind of approach to telling a story like this.
No, that's super fascinating, and I wanted to a bit transition into I guess the difference for you from writing a feature story to writing a book. And you recently wrote a book that I mentioned in the intro about your father and the memoir. And again, I wanted to say thank you, just because like it really touched a chord with me, who's lost my mother. And it's super well written. And I found it kind of interesting that you mentioned that your dad's a bad sleeper, and I thought about my dad being a bad sleeper. So to kind of transition
Yeah.
into, what is the process like for you to write a book compared to a feature article?
Well, it's interesting in that it's not dissimilar at all. It's just you're working with a larger space, right? You're working with a bigger canvas, so to say. I now, instead of having to contain a story to a chapter, which is about the size of a long form story. I mean, a long form story is generally, I'd say 2,500 words to 5,000 words, dependent. I mean, it can be longer, it can be shorter, I guess, but chapters are the same, right? If you really think about a chapter in a book, they're usually about that range. And so what you can do with a book that I was actually part of the reason why I really enjoy writing books is I can spend more time in sections that I would really have to truncate in a long form story. So I can, and because of that, you have more room to build in, I think, more of the subtle nuances, to have some more of this, the paint the picture and set up the tension in a way that you kind of want to speed through in a long form story. And that's not, I mean, long form story also provides a lot of room, and there's a skill to doing things short, but there's also a skill to doing things long. And so I sit down and I sort of think, okay, here's the story. And almost in the same way I think about a long form feature. The story is the same, right? So the story I wrote with my father, that book, there's a long form version of that possibly. I just have to sort of play around with it a little bit. But when I go, okay, chapter by chapter, these are the building blocks that are going to get me to the point of tension that's going to get some sort of resolution or not, and get to some sort of ending that's going to tie it all up. And so I've had the experience of sort of practicing that by ghostwriting. And my first book was was a co-author, a ghostwriter of Clint Malarchuk's book about his life and his journey. Then I had a chance to work with Buck Martinez, the baseball broadcaster, on a book that was a lot of fun, much different in nature. And in the midst of that, actually, it's interesting because that's when around that time is when I was offered an opportunity to write a biography of former Leafs coach and executive Pat Quinn and Vancouver Canucks. Sorry, I should clarify that, because Canucks would not be happy if I don't mention that part. And also had Hockey Canada's head coach of the gold medal team. But so Pat passed away in the November of 2013. The 23rd, trying to think, no, 2014, because I started working on that book. I took a lead from Sportsnet. This is my full first biography, which was a much different process because this is now being written in my voice. The writing in someone else's voice, it's freeing in a way. I mean, it's still stressful and it's still trying to tell the story, but in a way, I can kind of lean into having a character and almost like writing a fiction of something. But this was my own voice. By I mean fiction, sort of thinking of them as like a character with pieces of nonfiction, but it's less sort of me saying, "Here, I'm the narrator. This is my voice story, and I'm doing all the research in this." So this is more of a journalistic picture than I think. I should just clarify, and this is an interesting thing I was thinking about. I think when I write with somebody else, that there's journalism in that for sure, because that's I work really hard to make sure that is the truest account of that person's life possible, and we work together in that, right? So it's memoir, but it's also very much I interviewed tons of people, and it's very focused on truth and making sure this is because otherwise it's bull. It's not a good story if it's not true. Biography, I'm interviewing hundreds of people trying to pull this together and in a tight deadline. Now, what happened during that time is my father actually died in that spring or that summer. So in the midst of writing this big process, this big book, I dealt with the biggest conflict in my own life. And that became, so just, sorry, my dog's barking right now. So in this process, what happened was I was working through the hardest project I ever worked on. It came through. Then I dealt with the worst thing I've dealt with in my life. And then that book ended up becoming a way ended up being the story that I was then going to go and tell next. And so, but that was a story I couldn't tell in the way that I told other stories because it was a memoir. So I'm going in sort of a circle here to say that there's sort of like different elements to how I tell these stories. And the hardest one in the end ended up being the memoir, because it went from being sort of like now I'm the narrator to being like now I'm in many ways the subject along with my family, and telling the story. So when I look back now, I can see sort of the building blocks to getting to that point in the work I've done previously. And so even within the struggle of writing the Pat Quinn memoir biography, the sort of the framework, the tension for the memoir that was coming was being laid.
When you wrote, sorry, the book about your father, did that feel very freeing to you in terms of it was the first book that wasn't sports related at all?
Yeah. I really, so it's a thing because it's sort of like I don't know if it's an inherent insecurity or sensitivity to it, but like I like to think of myself as someone who's interested in stories that go way beyond sport, obviously, and as someone who's interested in writing stories that go way beyond sport. My profession though is to write stories that work within the realm of sport right now, and I'm very happy with that profession, and I'm not interested in leaving it, but having an opportunity to write about the world outside of it in a intimate way. Really, just it felt freeing for me, and it was just creatively interesting, intellectually interesting. I mean, it was also interesting because this is my own story, but it also sort of opened up the door that down the road I would love to do more
I was
nonfiction
gonna ask.
work
Yeah.
outside of the realm of sport. So yeah, it was definitely a nice departure from
Mhm.
sort of what I do, what
Mhm.
I've built my career on.
Is that almost something that you feel as though you really want to do going forward, in terms of writing a nonfiction book that isn't sports related again, that isn't, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I will write, I'll absolutely write more sports related nonfiction stories, but and or books. I think that because I love that, I love doing them too. And I think they're important stories. So as long as they're important stories with interesting people, I'll do all sort of both versions of that, biographies or working with someone telling their story. I mean, I really enjoy that process. But in terms of stories that, for example, I might pitch as my own, sort of being the author of. I think my interests, as I where I sit right now, and in the years to come, I think will continue to sort of drift be out of the arena, out of the court, out of the stadium, and look more sort of widely at potential topics. Now, that's like a very broad idea right now because you need a really sharp idea to be able to write a book,
Mhm.
but I absolutely don't feel sort of like stuck in the need to just write about sports.
I guess to ask the last question about the books you've been writing, you've written a lot of books about, I guess, Toronto athletes, or kind of people in the sports world in Toronto. And what are those? Is that something you think about actively when you write a book like that and seek out that? I don't want to say for commercial reasons, but is that somewhat of something that you think about when you write a book like that?
Interesting. So I sort of full disclosure on those books, they tend to be books that a publisher would ask me to write. So I mean, there
Okay.
is absolutely a commercial component to it, because the reality is you need a big market. I mean, you don't need a big market because like there wasn't a big market for my memoir, for example, right?
Mhm.
Nobody cared what I or
Well,
what
I
I
care, but
think or
yeah,
yeah, but in
yeah.
general, but in terms of like and I appreciate that, but in terms of like working with Doug Gilmore on his book, or when Pat Kim passed away, or Johnny Bauer, I mean, there's a reality of there's a wide audience for this story.
Mhm.
And I've been incredibly honored to have had the opportunity to work with publishers like HarperCollins and Penguin Random House, to be asked to be the person that sort of tries to encapsulate that story and present that story to people who desperately want to learn more about that person. And I think of those challenges. It's interesting because they're so well known. I enjoy the challenge of going out and trying to tell something new about them. So in Bauer and in Quinn, the two biographies that I wrote, I worked really hard in sort of journalistic fashion to sort of go back into their histories, and I think I was successful from people who had thought they kind of knew everything about these people to sort of present a fully formed character, a sense of like what propelled them to be who they became, like why was Johnny Bowers, somebody who became a legend in Leafs lore. It wasn't just because he was a good goalie. There was a lot to him, and also how he persisted, going through the Great Depression and the war, and being 34 years old when he first made to the NHL. I mean, there's just an incredible story there. So I sort of get the opportunity. Someone says, "Here's the topic. Now make a great story out of it." And so that's been the joy and the challenge for me. But in terms of that, like for example, I'm not like a Leafs fan. Like I'm not
Oh,
sort
really?
of, no,
Okay.
I'm not. I don't. I'm not like, oh, I care about the Toronto Maple Leafs. I actually grew up a Habs fan. I was a Patrick Waugh fan.
Oh,
And
okay.
I grew up liking. I was a goalie growing up, so
Oh,
I like players more than anything. I was around for the Leafs run in '93 when Doug Gilmour and those guys were playing. So when I worked with Doug Gilmour in his book, I there was a little bit of like, oh, this is pretty cool. I'm I was 10 years old at that time, so they're naturally built into that nostalgia that I had. But I actually, as a sports fan, I don't really have like a cheering interest.
okay.
And I think that's been to my benefit as a writer somewhat, because I've been able to sort of I can be somewhat dispassionate from it all, but still really enjoy and be enthralled in the story of it all.
Mhm.
And so that's been the benefit to me. So yeah, so not really a Leafs fan, but yes, I have produced quite a bit of content for.
I just presumed just as living in
I don't hate the Leafs. Like I like them. I
yeah.
like going to Leafs game. I live in Toronto, so I enjoy it. But it's never been sort of. I didn't grow up sort of with Leafs. Well, actually, no, I did grow up with the Johnny Bauer picture on my wall because my aunt had gotten it for me. But that's part of the story that I wrote
Mhm.
in the book. But I didn't grow up sort of dreaming of becoming
Belief
a Leaf fan. I did grow up dreaming of becoming an NHL goalie because I was like a Curtis Joseph fan and a Patrick Waugh fan and a Marty Brodeur fan and
Mhm.
Ulf Coles. I can go through all of that. Like, I'm a huge nerd
Yeah,
about sending, so that's where my passion lies. Yeah.
yeah. I guess I shouldn't ask this, but who's your favorite goalie right now in the NHL?
Oh, right now, currently. Oh, that's really interesting. You know what? I'm trying to think of who would be my favorite because some of them just Lundqvist was my favorite for a while because of his
Okay.
style and just how calm and he played. I mean, I know he's retired now, although it's interesting because I interviewed him in New York one time and I had like I hate locker rooms and I had this sort of interaction with him where I waited around and then he basically just like turned around when I went to ask him a question and was like, "I'm done." I'm like, "Well, that it's like never meet your heroes kind of thing," right? I was like, "Okay, well, I didn't get anything out of him," but I wrote a nice story about him in the end. But he was sort of the guy I think for the last little while that always I really enjoyed. And now I mean I'm really intrigued by Carey Price. And again, I'm sort of drawn into stories more than
And
style
there's
and
and
form. Like I think there's some great goaltending out there, but I actually like goalies because they're interesting. Like
yeah.
there's a thing about goalies that goes beyond, like I think it's the most stressful position in sport, and I will argue anybody about that. And I think it's one of the most athletic positions in sport and the most mentally like challenging. Like the focus that's required is like unparalleled, I think. And then you everyone's like, oh, goalies are so quirky. And it's like, well, yeah, like there's a reason why they're so quote unquote quirky and
Yeah.
interesting. And so I'm drawn to that. And I Carey Price I'm drawn to because he's so stoic. And he doesn't he just seems so serious. And now with what's sort of going on in his career, I'm just kind of drawn to that story too, just for that the
Yeah.
story nature of it all. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I totally get it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of uh recent future stories that you wrote. And firstly, the one that's really in the news a lot about the Hockey Canada story. I asked your colleague Ian Mendez when he was on
Yeah.
and about that process. And I guess I just wanted to know what your side or your perspective of writing that story was and how it all came about.
Yeah, and so I've been very lucky at the Athletic in particular to work with some exceptional colleagues. And I think I had exceptional colleagues in Sportsnet for sure, but now I just have like new like across the United States and Canada. Like I just have way more. And though we don't get to meet in person often, we talk constantly in Zoom. Like I was texting with Ian just before we spoke. And Ian is just a tremendous example of like a respected, beloved beat writer in a city that also cares about like the stories beyond. And so I've had an opportunity to work with him on another story previously about Eugene Melnyk, which
I'm gonna ask you about that after. So
yeah.
yeah.
And so that story kind of our team, I worked with Katie Strang on that as well. And she's like just one of the most exceptional investigative journalists in sport right now. And I've had a chance to work with her and learn from her. And just, I'm really blessed to have her as a colleague. And so we've been working together on some difficult stories. And in this case, what I find the most interesting is the skill sets that come into play in a story like this. So I'll get to Hockey Canada in a second, but in terms of that sort of triangle of reporting, you have someone like Ian who is an exceptional contact maker, someone who everyone knows, everyone respects. He knows everybody around the league, and people know him. You have someone like Katie, who just is like a relentless investigator, someone who knows how to find information that people are trying to hide, and knows how to get on the phone and get people to tell her things, because she and from because she's right, like from the perspective, like, this is important to do,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
she's exceptional at investigating and uncovering. And I add to that, I think, being a feature writer, I think I add an element of being able to tell the story, being able to, in some cases, work with sources in a different way, and be able to bring sort of a broad sort of lens, and also reporting and investigating as well, which I would do. But the three of us working together has become something that, I think, without us realizing it would work that way, I think worked exceptionally well, just because of our different skill sets. So that's been a real luxury to have at the Athletic.
I guess my question to go to the Hockey Canada and Eugene Melnyk, were you guys working together first on Melnyk and then Hockey Canada came and you
Yeah.
continued together? Okay.
So what happened there actually was, Melnyk, we were working on Melnyk for a long time, and we were working on that story together, because of the sort of what I just set up, Ian being in Ottawa, having the context, being intimately connected to that market and to the people involved, in terms of in terms of his coverage, and Katie being an investigator who worked really closely on the with the Arizona Coyotes, and doing like some exceptional investigative work in several areas, was sort of focusing on that story. And then I was working with them in both capacities of really focusing on trying to, and I think one of the things that I was trying to bring there was sort of an element of nuance. I mean, it's a very complicated
Mm-hmm.
story, a very complicated man, someone who clearly was not an effective leader when it came to the Ottawa Senators, and really alienated a lot of people and hurt a lot of people. But at the same time, in his life, helped people, and had insecurities, and had connections. And so there's certain characters in that story, and as we went along, that I
Yeah.
think worked really hard to develop relationships with. That the intent there was to show a fulsome picture of a life, the most complete picture of this person that we could. And so that's sort of, I think, if I look at where he came into, that was sort of my contribution to that story.
No,
Um,
I wanted to piggyback. I thought I forget his name, but the Ukrainian friend in
yeah, yeah,
in that story was just such an interesting wrinkle where you could really, again, this is very inside baseball into that story, but in terms of seeing the immense generosity Melnyk would show, and then the complete opposite. And I think you guys really captured. I didn't know Melnyk, but it felt as though you really got the essence of him in that article.
well, that means, so the thing about that article, like, we got a lot of backlash for that, obviously, and I frankly, I can say to you, I was quite disappointed with some of the backlash we got, just because I don't
From
think people that read the story in some case, I think they thought, okay, here's a takedown piece of a person. I don't think it was a takedown piece of a person. Right? I think I'm somewhat, frankly, I'm insulted by anyone who says it is, and I would love to sit down with them and talk to them about journalism, and talk to them about storytelling, and how you, even though I get the sensitivity when someone passes, but you don't shy away from truth just because somebody has passed away. You don't go, here's a fake account of their life. You tell the story of their life, and you tell it in a complete way. And I don't think the story, when you read it, says this person wasn't someone who was loved in any capacity, or wasn't capable of love in any capacity, but it tries to get to the root of motivation, and tries to get to the root of the complications in his relationships. And for that reason, I'm very proud of that story. I know we all are, and I think that it's something that, for me, I don't care about sort of if people were upset about it, but I just, when I look at it, as a piece of journalism that we produced, I'm glad that I think it does provide layers to a man. And to me, that's what the best stories do. They don't, or to a person, or to an issue. They don't just sort of say, we made up our mind, here's the story. We talk to, I mean, like, there's no, I don't even know the number off the top of my head right now, but it's, over 100 for sure. Like, just in terms of the work that we did, worked really hard to make sure that it was a true account. So and it's interesting because nobody's actually questioned any of the details in the story. Like, no one's come out saying, oh, that part's not
that's
true. because it's all true. But there's sort of it's more the sensitivity and timing and how dare you. But I think in those cases too, a lot of people read headlines, and that's what we seem to see a lot right now, right? People just reading headlines and not reading the actual substance of a story, and not just being willing to see what the story is showing you. Because that's also part of what we're doing here. We're not telling you what to think. I'm not saying here's this, here's that. Here's the story. Here's Sirhe, who shows up and loves this man. So he's a man who Melnyk gave every opportunity to, right? But then, and I know you don't want to get into the minutia of the story, someone should go read it, but then turned his back on, but then still there was a complicated love there, right? So anyway, I find that I love when we're writing these kinds of stories because of that element, because we can get into that complexity. And the biggest frustration I have is when that is just sort of because of I guess the heat of the article, the heat of the topic gets overlooked, and no one actually is paying attention to what you actually did in the work. Just the fact that you published something and who published it, and this notion that it was some sort of attempt at a hit job. But anyway, that's my rant. So
I guess my question is, did you feel or have you received a similar backlash to the Hockey Canada story?
the Hockey Canada story is interesting. So I'm glad you asked about that, because yes, I mean we've received backlash to Hockey Canada, but never from, again, a perspective of what we've written, right? Everything we've written has been, this is what's happening. This is what happened. So Katie and I went to London together, and Ian worked on the story with us as well. And it was the story about sort of what happened that night. So we were working from multiple angles to try and figure out information about the allegations from the 2018 incident with Hockey Canada's World Junior players that has led to sort of this unraveling. And that story, I mean, that was just, we reported that story out to try and paint the clearest portrait of what happened. And then subsequent to that, well, before that, actually written about hockey culture in general. That one gets a little bit of backlash because people don't like when you criticize something they love. But everything in that story is an example of something that's happened. And the people that we spoke to as experts are people who've been studying this and can talk about this culture. So while there is some backlash, I think for the most part, most people are saying, like, this is important. You're exposing this. We're having this conversation. We're getting this out there, and it needs to be done. Every once in a while, like on Twitter, you'll sort of see like, oh, you guys hate hockey. How dare you? Like, why don't you go look at football now? That kind of stuff. And you're like, well, like, we're writing about hockey now. Like, yes, there's room to look at football. There's room to look at every element of society in which there's negative things and terrible things happening. But right now we're looking at hockey, and in Canada, we're looking at Hockey Canada as the organization that sort of like holds this beloved sport, holds the responsibility of this beloved sport. And if from the top, it's not carrying that responsibility in the way that anyone who loves the game would want it to, then that needs to be challenged. That needs to come out. That needs to be discussed. And so I find most of the backlash to be very superficial, very like, oh, this is just ridiculous. And I don't listen to that. But for the most part, I think, just in speaking with people and and getting, emails and talking to, getting feedback, I think people are grateful that we're looking into it, that Rick Westhead at TSN obviously is doing exceptional work looking into it. I mean, even media has done some great work recently on this story. What's really interesting about the story, actually, the Globe and Mail, I have to say, of course, my good friend Grant Robertson at the Globe and Mail uncovered the National Equity Fund. Like, he's an incredible journalist who actually does write a lot about sports. He's won 2 sports NNAs, but like, no one thinks of him as a sports writer, and he's probably one of the best journalists in Canada. But he looks at documents, he uncovers things, and he uncovered that's basically the story right now, really, is sort of this equity fund. So I've really enjoyed this story because journalists from each element, I don't think we feel like we're working against each other at all. I feel like, in a way, we want to have the next story, want it to be a big story, but like, we're gaining almost from each other's expertise and how we do things well, and it's creating a really damning picture right now. And so I think from if I were to zoom out from sort of being one of the journalists involved in this, in a small way, looking at all of the colleagues from different networks and or different organizations that I have, I'm really interested in this moment in journalism because of the effect that it's having on an issue, and in a way that doesn't feel like, I shouldn't say it doesn't feel competitive, because we're all competitive, but it feels like there's a benefit to every news story that somebody has uncovered coming out.
Just uh, you said that very eloquently, and thank you for that. My question kind of to that is, I've thought about this a lot lately of what is the role of sports journalists in the matters of abuse. And uh, obviously you guys and many others have started now to, for example, Rick Westhead with Kyle Beach, and you mentioned the National Equity Fund with Greg Robertson. I think that's the right. I wanted to know, do you feel as though there needs to be more of an onus on journalists to delve into these stories rather than just being an insider and following the scores and trades?
It's interesting because I think it's tough. Like I have to say too, I don't and I know there's there's some criticism lobbed at sports for being soft and for being inside, but I do think I'm sensitive to that too somewhat because I recognize the work that say a beat reporter does every single day, having to navigate relationships inside a locker room, having to navigate relationships with executives, and having to frankly entertain and engage an audience in a real constant way. And so to then go now step out of this and write about abuse or racial inequity and these kinds of things. I mean, I think that it's not necessarily fair to sort of assume that they're going to catch all those stories and then all of a sudden be able to like zero in on them and like only focus on that to the extent to the detriment of like the rest of what they do. And so I think that it's important that it's the onus should be on the journalistic organizations, like on the Athletic, on
Okay.
TSN, on Sportsnet, on the Globe, everywhere else, to employ people that can tell these stories. I think that every journalist should be engaged in these stories. Every journalist should be aware of these stories and their own inherent bias in these stories. So I don't think anybody should go in there like that's a reporter should be sort of dismissive of these things and say, oh, just stick to sports, for example. Like, don't even worry about it. And not ask questions about this. I mean, I do think there's an onus on journalists to be asking those questions and to be putting some pressure in a daily basis on these issues and to be exposing injustices and cover-ups as they happen. But at the same time, I'm not like, I'm not critical of the fact that like, it's not necessary, like that is Rick Westhead that breaks that story, because like he also can he can exist as I can exist sort of at an arm's length from organizations and from the league and be able to kind of ask those questions without and he gets don't get me wrong, like it's not easy at all, but he then does have to go write about like leaf trades, for example, right, which is like a different relationship. So there is complexity, I think, to the industry. And I think the one thing about sports writing that I think people don't understand is that there are so many different elements to it. It's not just one thing. And there's so many different skill sets within it. And so what we're seeing now with Hockey Canada story, I think, is I think there's some journalists with a unique set of skill sets and opportunity that are really focusing on this story. And I do think every sports journalist, like in the hockey world right now, should be front of mind for sure. This should be something that shows up in stories or gets discussed. There should be reaction from executives, that kind of stuff. But on a daily basis, there's no way they can possibly be focusing on.
Yeah. No, I totally understand what you're trying to say in terms of if you're following day to day, you don't need to maybe do another feature, right, or feature story on the stuff, but once it's out, especially, you shouldn't just say, oh, I'm just going to stick to sports and not talk about it.
And not ask tough questions. I mean, I think like we can also go too far and be like, well, I'm not going to ask this defenseman about something because like, all they want to do is play hockey. I mean, there's, I don't think throwing softball questions at athletes is necessary either. So there's a bit of just a bit of a reality to the nature of the job that I think needs to be considered.
No, of course. I guess to kind of wrap this bow up, I wanted to know first a bit about, you've mentioned your process of becoming a feature writer and writing books. What other advice would you give that you maybe haven't mentioned so far to up and coming journalists or writers?
I think the best advice I would give would be to do what other people aren't doing and look where other people aren't looking for stories. So the one thing that I found the most sort of intimidating, especially when you get started, is like there's so many especially now. I mean, everyone's on Twitter, was talking, it's this constant conversation. And it's sort of like, you can feel left out if you're not like being retweeted and being someone that people are turning to for, advice or line changes or who should be traded, this kind of stuff. And I think that when I look at the people who have really carved out some success, it's, if you really look at what they do, you recognize that there's a difference to it. And so I think finding what you do differently and being confident in that and leaning into that is a good thing. Obviously, be open to criticism. Don't be too sensitive. Like, be willing to grow. That's essential. If you have an ego, I mean, all writers have egos, all journalists have egos to a certain extent. But if you let that get in your way, it's going to get in your way. It's going to block you from, I think, growing. So recognize that, like, everybody in every position has an opportunity to get better what they do. So listen to feedback, but don't be consumed by it. Don't be because you can go too far one way and think you're no good at this and feel like you're an imposter and all that kind of stuff. So be confident in what you do. If people have engaged with you and give you a compliment, like, be happy about that and lean into that. Like, keep going where you provide a unique perspective. You provide a unique skill set to tell a story. I know I've always, like, if I'm in a locker room, for example, I'm never in a scrum. I can't stand scrums. And some of the best advice I've gotten from journalists I really respect and follow is, speak to the person that no one's speaking to. That's where the good stories are. That's where the stories that tell the bigger picture stories come from. It's not from the person that everybody else is looking at and asking the same question to. It's the person that no one's paying attention to. So just be strategic in that sense and be confident.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate that. That was a great, I think, for any up and coming journalist, that's a great way to approach it. Look for the story rather than where everyone is. I guess just to ask you, what stuff are you working on right now? Any pieces you want to plug or share with us?
Well, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of what I've got several interviews coming up. I'm in that bit of the zone right now of, like, there's stories that are, like, exist, but I'm reporting them out to see where they become. But I think in the next couple months, I've got some interesting ones, kind of actually one I'm working on about psychology in sports, actually, and about how we defeat ourselves and how we combat the inner challenge that we pose to ourselves. So that's that's one I'm just really interested in. A couple others coming up like that. So they're kind of on the realm of sort of think pieces like, how does this work for an athlete and stuff. So that's fun. And then there's more Hockey Canada to come for sure.
Okay.
In multiple ways. I mean, there's a new hearing that was just announced, obviously.
Yeah, on the floor.
So I don't think the Hockey Canada story is going away, and I think that there's going to be from a variety of outlets some really rich important reporting to come. I can only imagine, like, this anyone paying attention to the story knows that there's a lot more story that needs to be told, and I think that's I'm less excited about that because I think it's a tough story. I mean, that's a story that, like, there's sort of stories I write that I'm like, this is really interesting and fun, and, like, people are gonna love to read this, and there's stories that are like, this is tough. Like, I've been accused of not liking hockey. Like, I love hockey. Obviously, hockey's been a huge part of my life. It's been part of my career. It's heartbreaking, really, to see. I mean, the very specific things happening, like, the story that's come out of 2018 and 2003, and those are just horrific. But then also just to see like, I think sort of the culture of the game be challenged and discussed in a way that needs to be discussed, and kind of sad that it's a lot of people have talked about how things are different and everyone's getting better, and we're in a good place right now, and, like, we're doing the right training. But, like, I don't think hockey's much different than when I was in the locker room, and when 10 years before that others were in the locker room. I think that hockey does a very good job of being superficial in terms of how it's moving, but being very insular and reactive in terms of anybody trying to challenge the status quo within it. So to me, that's actually a really sad story, but it's one I'm going to keep working on.
And hopefully it changes. And I think with what you guys have done, I think it's definitely going on the right direction, but hopefully change happens faster than slower. Sorry. Yeah. So anyways, thank you so much for coming on. This was great. It was great to talk to you and really get the insight into your career and your life. And what makes you such a good writer. So thank you so much, Dan, for coming on.
Thanks, Alex. Really appreciate it.
And listeners, will have another Behind the Play coming up soon. So stay tuned and see you soon. Bye.